Laura Ingalls Wilder once said that in the Florida piney woods, a Yankee woman was a greater curiosity than the alligators. She meant herself. She'd gone south in desperation, hoping the warm air would mend the legs of fever left crippled in her husband. The air did mend him. It never warmed to her. And that one lonely year is what turned the Wilders toward Missouri, and the rocky farm that finally saved them. That is where we are going tonight, south into the heat, and all the way back out again. Stay with me, and we'll walk it slowly from the very beginning. Before we take the first step, if these quiet stories are good for you, and only if they are, you're welcome to subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. The three little books live at prairiesecrets.com. On a television, you can scan the code on your screen. On a phone, they're waiting in the description and the pinned comments. Thank you for being here, and if you drift off partway through, let yourself. That's what it's for. So, let's go back to the very beginning of it, all the way back to Dakota Territory, to a small railroad town out on the open grassland called De Smet in the middle of the 1880s. That is where a young woman named Laura Ingalls married a young farmer named Almanzo Wilder. It was the 25th of August, 1885. A minister named Edward Brown said the words over the two of them, and then they went out to make a life together on his homestead on the wide Dakota prairie outside the town. They did the thing a hopeful young couple did in that country in those years. They bet on wheat, and not some cautious little patch of it, tucked in beside the garden for safety. Almanzo meant to plant acre after acre of good seed wheat and let the ground pay the two of them back for all the labour of putting it in. That was the plan. That was really the whole of the plan. And out there, in a fair year, it was not a foolish one at all. You have to understand what wheat was to a man like Almanzo, or none of the rest of this will quite land. Wheat was money you could stand in the middle of. Wheat was next winter's flour and next spring's seed, and the payment on the land, and someday a new team of horses. All of it out there swaying together in one long golden field. But there is a hard edge tucked inside a plan like that, and it is worth naming now, quietly, because it is going to matter a great deal later on. When a young couple stakes everything on the one crop, they are making a kind of bargain with a single field and a single season. Seed costs money going in. So does the land and the team and the flour to carry you through to harvest. And the way it's so often worked out in that country, a farmer borrowed against a harvest that had not come in yet, betting that the wheat would stand tall enough, come autumn, to pay back all he had laid out to grow it. In a good year, that bargain made a man. But it left nothing underneath him if the year went wrong. One crop, one sky, one turn of the season, and if that one crop failed, there was no second thing planted alongside it to catch the fall. They were not thinking about that part, of course. Nobody betting on a green field in spring is thinking about the autumn it might not pay. And a wheat year asks for a particular kind of patience and a particular kind of nerve. You put the seed in, and then for long stretches there is nothing much to do but tend it and wait and watch the sky and hope the rain comes when the wheat needs it and holds off when it does not. So much of it rides on a handful of moments a body cannot control at all. A dry spell at the wrong week, a hard storm at the wrong week, and the whole year's work leans one way or the other. That was the bargain they had taken on. A great deal of labour first, and then a long wait on the weather, with nearly everything they had riding on how a single crop came through. A strong back, a good team, enough acres, and a little mercy from the sky. And a young farmer could build something on that prairie that would hold his family for the rest of their days. That was the promise the whole country was making to people exactly like them. Almanzo believed it. Very nearly all of them did. The following winter, on the 5th of December, 1886, a daughter came to them, and they named her Rose. So now there were three out on the claim. A husband, young and strong. A wife who had grown up on this very frontier, and who knew, right down in her bones, exactly what it was going to ask of her. And now a small girl in the house, to do the whole of it for. Hold on to that picture for a little while, because it is where everything we're going to walk through tonight quietly begins. 2 young people, 1 baby daughter, and 1 plan. And the plan, start to finish, was wheat. Here is what neither of them could possibly see, standing there at the front of it all. The years just ahead of them, the very first years of their marriage, were going to be about the hardest of their whole lives. But nobody counts trouble on a wedding day. With the crop still green and standing in the field, you count the acres, not the disasters. You count what you're hoping to gain, and you let the rest stay out past the horizon, where it belongs. And the disasters did come in their own time. Not all in one terrible night, the way we might arrange it if we were making it up. They came the way real trouble almost always comes, in a slow line, one behind the other, with just enough quiet in between each one for a person to start hoping again before the next arrived. That prairie, which had looked so much like a promise, would spend the next several years quietly taking things back one by one. The crop, then the house, then the savings, and then a few things far harder to say out loud than any of those. But not that first year. That first year they were simply a young married couple with a new baby and a field of wheat, believing exactly what young people are meant to believe. That grit would be enough, that the land would reward them for staying on it, that a body, a good and healthy young body, would always do what it was told. The body was the first thing the prairie came for. The winter of 1888 came down over that country hard, the way the Dakota winters always did, and it carried into their little house something that grit and a strong back could do absolutely nothing about: diphtheria. It is a word that has mostly lost its power to frighten us now, and we ought to be grateful for that every day of our lives. But in that century, on that frontier, it was a word that emptied houses and frightened whole towns. It was a sickness that did not care in the slightest how strong you were, or how young, or how much work was standing out in the field waiting on you to come back to it. It came for both of them, for Laura and for Almanzo, husband and wife, both taken ill in the very same season, under the very same roof, with a little girl not yet 2 years old to think of. Back among the rest of the Ingalls family, Laura's younger sister Grace was keeping a diary that winter, and she set the date of it down in her own hand, the way people do with the things that frighten them, just to make them hold still on the page. And so we know. Early in 1888 the sickness was inside the Wilder house, and both of the grown people in it were down with it. Sit for a moment with what that even means. Out on a claim like theirs, a good way from the nearest help. The 2 people who run a place like that, who do the hauling and the tending and the minding of a child, were both laid low by the same illness at the same time. You do not need a scene inside that house to feel the danger in it. You only need to know that the whole of that small household rested on 2 people, and that the sickness took them both at once. They were both, by every account, very ill. And then the worst of the danger passed. That is the place in a story where things are supposed to turn back up toward the light. Both of them had lived. The child had been spared. By every ordinary way of measuring such things, they had come through it. But diphtheria does not always leave a house the same way it came into it. Laura recovered, and she recovered fully. The sickness left no lasting mark on her body. Almanzo did not come through it the same way at all. When the fever had passed, it left something behind in him that it had not left in her. The illness, or something bound up close with it, had taken the strength partly out of his legs. And this is where we slow ourselves right down and give it room, because this turn matters more than almost anything else in the whole of it, and we are not going to rush past it the way so many tellings do. Here is the outcome, and I will give it to you carefully, because it is all the record really holds. His legs were left partly paralysed by what that sickness did to him. He could stand, and he could walk, but not the way he once had, and never again the way he once had. From that winter onward he would limp for the rest of his long life, and from that winter onward he would need a cane to carry himself across a room and out into the yard. That plain wooden cane became a part of him, as much a part of him as his hat or his own 2 hands. Keep half an eye on it as we go tonight, because that cane is going to travel a very long way with this family before we are through. It came into his life on this one hard winter, and it never once left it. Now, exactly what happened inside him during that illness, later accounts and scholars have not entirely agreed on it. Some have called it a stroke, come on while the sickness had him weakened. Others have called it a complication of the diphtheria itself, something that inflamed the nerves and left the damage behind. The records disagree here, and honestly, both are later attempts to explain the same sudden and lasting damage. What is not in any doubt at all is the outcome. A young man who had every reason to count on his own body found, all at once, that he no longer entirely could. And it is hard not to feel what a change like this would do to a man like Almanzo. He had walked into that winter as one kind of man, a young wheat farmer whose whole plan and whose whole idea of himself ran straight down through his own 2 strong legs and his own 2 strong hands. He came out the far side of it needing a cane to cross a room. His body had been the plan, and now, in a sense, his body had become one more thing that had to be managed. And there is something particularly hard in that, for a farmer above almost any other kind of person. A farmer's strength is not only how he feels of a morning, it is his tool and his savings and his security all at once. It is the thing he has instead of money in the bank. When a shopkeeper falls ill, his goods are still there on the shelf waiting for him. When a farmer's body is taken part way from him, a good part of what he actually had to work with goes with it. And for a young man who had staked his whole future on exactly that strength, that is no small thing to have to live around. And a change like that does not stay a quiet matter between a man and his own legs for very long. Think only of what a farm asks of a body, day in and day out. The field, the animals, the hauling, the lifting, the endless mending of a place. It is not hard to imagine that a man who could no longer fully trust his legs would find the practical shape of all that work changed, and changed for good, and that what a farm could and could not be for this family began, from here, to bend around what his body could still do. A limitation like this reaches into everything on a farm, quietly, and nothing about their situation got any easier for it. And here is the part of it that is hardest not to feel. He was still a young man. This was not the slow stiffening that finally comes to a body after a long lifetime of good work. This came for him near the very start before the life had really even begun. In the very years he ought to have been at the strongest he would ever be. The cane was not waiting for him at the end of a long road. It was there, near the beginning of one. They did not fold up and quit. That was not in either of them, so far as anything they left behind can tell us. They stayed on the land, and they kept at the wheat, because the wheat was still the plan, and because what else was there to do but keep on going? But something had changed now that could not be changed back. The quiet assumption every young farmer makes that his own body will carry his family through could not simply be made anymore, not the way it had been made before, and from here forward, though they could not have known it yet, that Cain and the legs that needed it would sit somewhere underneath every large decision the 2 of them made, including, a few years on, a decision to load up what they had left and go looking for a warmer country, clear on the far side of the country, in the hope that it might help him where a Dakota winter so plainly had not. But that was still down the road. First, that same prairie had a good deal more it meant to take. The summer of 1889 came, and with it, for a short while, something that should have been the very opposite of grief. Laura was going to have another child. After the fever, after the cane, after the hard turn their young marriage had already taken, there was a baby on the way. A second child for the 2 of them. A little brother or sister for Rose. Whatever else was pressing in on them from every side that year, there was that. There was that ordinary, enormous, everyday hope. And in that summer, the child came, and it was a boy. Grace, back in her diary again, wrote a few tender words about him. She wrote that Laura's little baby boy looked just like Manly. Manly was the family's own pet name for Almanzo, so you can very nearly see the whole of it in that one small line from a young aunt's diary. A son, with his father's own face already there in his, born to a worn young family in the middle of the hardest stretch of their lives. He lived about 2 weeks. We go carefully here, and slowly, because this is the kind of loss that does not want to be rushed, and does not want to be dressed up in fine words either. The family's own records do not entirely agree on the exact days of it, on precisely when he came and precisely when he was gone, and we're not going to reach for a full certainty the family itself never had. What is certain is the shape of the thing. In the summer of 1889, Laura and Almanzo had a son, and about 2 weeks later, that son had died. He was never given a name. Out where they buried him, the small stone that marks the place does not carry one. It reads only, baby son of A.J. Wilder, Almanzo's own initials and nothing more. A whole little life and a family's whole grief pressed down into 4 plain words cut into a stone. Think for just a moment about that absence of a name. The stone gives us the father's initials and the plain fact of a son, and nothing more. In a century when infants were lost far too often, families carried such losses in all sorts of private ways. What the stone tells us is those 4 words, and sometimes the fewest words are the ones that end up carrying the most. And here is the detail I keep coming back to, the one that tells you more than any scene we could ever invent for it. For the rest of her long life, Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote so very much, who set so many of her own days and her family's days down on paper for the whole wide world to read, almost never once spoke of this. She wrote about killing winters and lost crops and loneliness and endless work. This she kept. As far as the record shows, she carried it, in her own silence, all the way to the end of her life. We should let that silence be exactly what it is. We should not go pouring words into it that were never hers to begin with. Some griefs never do get told. They only get carried quietly, underneath everything else, for years and years on end. And Laura would carry this one for years. Onto every road this family took afterward. Down through the fire that was still coming that very same summer, and through the debt, and through the long journey south we're walking slowly toward tonight. That small unnamed grave, and those 4 plain words cut into the little stone would be there in the back of all of it. A weight that never quite set down. You will hear people say that the frontier was hard. It was. But we say it so easily that the word goes soft and stops meaning very much at all. What it meant, right here, was a young family who lost a newborn son in the same season everything else was going wrong, and who had a small daughter still to raise, and a place still to run, and no one in the world coming to do any of it for them. That is what the hard word covers, when you stop and look underneath it. Not a single dramatic night. A loss folded quietly into a year that had no room to stop and grieve it. They buried their son in the summer of 1889, and that very same summer, the Prairie reached into what was left of their lives and took more. I told you the Prairie was not finished with them that summer, and it was not. In that same summer of 1889, in the very same handful of months, the little family lost their home to a fire. The house they had been living in was there, and then it was gone. What set it? No one can say for certain now. What is certain is the loss itself. A home is never only its walls, and losing one takes a good deal more from a family than lumber. And as though the sky had decided to finish whatever the fire had started, the crop failed that same season too, in a drought. The wheat, the whole plan, the golden field that was supposed to pay them back for all of it, dried under a hard sun, and the harvest they had counted on did not come. So there it all was, laid out across one single summer. A newborn son lost, a home burned, a crop failed. The 3 things a life stands up on, family and shelter and a living, all struck inside the same few months. Try to hold all three of those in your mind at the same time, because they were living all three of them at the same time. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes over people when trouble stops arriving politely, one at a time, and starts arriving all together before you have even finished grieving one loss before the next is already sitting on top of you. That was the summer they were having. Not one blow you could brace for and recover from. A whole season of them stacked one on the next. And notice what kinds of things these losses were, because they were not all the same kind. One was a person, the child. One was a place, the house. One was a living, the crop. 3 different griefs, really, of the sort a person would ordinarily meet one at a time across a whole life, with years given between them to take each one in. They came instead inside a single summer, folded together so that there was no clean edge between the end of one and the start of the next. And beneath all 3 of them sat the oldest trouble of all, the one that ties every other trouble tighter, which was money, which is exactly where this particular summer was quietly leading. And a home, once it is gone, takes something with it that is larger than the house. It was the place they had meant to raise their children. It was the proof, to themselves as much as to anyone, that they had made something out here and meant to stay. When that goes, the quiet idea that this ground was truly theirs goes a little with it. They did not have the room to stop and feel any of it. There was still a small girl to keep fed and warm. There was still a husband with a cane, and now no house to keep him out of the weather. Whatever was left of that wheat farm, whatever was left of the bright plan they had married on, was thinning down toward almost nothing now, right there in the plain summer light. And somewhere in a family, in a season like that one, a quiet arithmetic begins, not spoken out loud, maybe not even fully admitted yet. Just a slow, sinking sense that this place, and this plan, and this particular piece of the wide prairie might not turn out to be the answer after all. That staying could be costing them more than leaving ever would. They were not there yet. But the ground for it was being laid that summer, in ash and in dry, cracked dirt. And then the numbers came in. And the numbers, in the end, were the hardest part of all. There is a number that comes down to us out of this stretch of the Wilders' lives, and it comes to us from their own daughter. Years and years later, when Rose was fully grown and had become a writer in her own right, she looked back on these Dakota years and set down what the money had truly been like. She remembered it as 7 straight years of complete crop failure. And she remembered the rate of interest the family had been paying on the money they borrowed just to buy food to put on the table. She put that rate at 36%. That is Rose's memory of it, written down a long time afterward, not a figure copied off an audited bank ledger. It is a daughter's recollection of what the debt had felt like, and of the shape of the trap her mother and father were caught in. And taken as exactly that, it still tells you something no cold ledger ever could. And it is worth remembering who Rose was in these years. Born out on that claim in the winter of 1886, she was a small child right through the fever and the fire and the debt, growing up inside this exact stretch of hardship. What she gives us is not the cool distance of a clerk copying a ledger, but the memory of someone who was there in the middle of it and carried the shape of those years with her. That does not make her figures exact. It makes them worth listening to closely. 36%. There is something almost funny in that, in the particular way that only something genuinely cruel can manage to be funny. As Rose remembered it, you borrowed money because you were hungry, because years of dead crops had left you nothing, and the price of that borrowed food money was more than 1/3 again piled on top of what you had borrowed. As she told it, it was not a rate meant to help a family hold on to their land. It was a rate that seemed built to pry them loose from it. Put Rose's memory of the money up against everything else, and you can finally see the whole box they had been shut inside. The crop that was supposed to pay the debt had failed, and by her account not once but year after year. The house that was supposed to shelter them had burned. The strong young body that was supposed to outwork all of it now leaned on a cane, and the money they borrowed just to keep eating carried, in Rose's telling, a rate that made climbing back out all but impossible. This is the part of a hard life that never does make for a dramatic scene, and so it is usually the part that gets skipped straight over. There is no single terrible night here to point at. There is only arithmetic, quiet and patient and relentless, doing its slow work in the background of every ordinary day. Two young people doing very nearly everything right, working as hard as two people can work, and still watching the ground slide out from under them. Because if their own daughter had it right, the numbers had been stacked against them from the very start. You can only fight arithmetic like that for so long. At some point, staying on the land stops being courage and quietly turns into a slow way of going under. What we can see is not the private moment but the outcome. The wheat, the claim, the whole bright plan they had married their lives to had failed to save them, and somewhere in these years the family let the Dakota land go. If there was humility in that, and it is hard to imagine there was not, it stayed theirs. What we can see is the next place they went. And when a family finally lets go of a piece of land they have fought that hard to keep, there is rarely anywhere grand waiting for them to go. For Laura and Almanzo, the place to go was back to his people. In 1890, the two of them, with little Rose, left Dakota behind and moved to Spring Valley, Minnesota to stay with Almanzo's parents. It was, by the plainest description, a time of rest and of recovery, especially for Almanzo. I would not want to make this sound softer than it really was. Here were two people who, only a few years before, had set out to build a place entirely their own, to be the ones the help came from rather than the ones who needed it. And now here they were, grown and married and parents themselves, staying under a parent's roof to get through. That is its own quiet kind of weight. Still, whatever it cost them, it did what it was there to do. Spring Valley was a pause, a stretch of rest and recovery, especially for Almanzo. Time to let a body ease, time to sit still long enough to begin, very cautiously, to think about what on earth they were going to do next. And that thinking, quiet as it was, mattered more than it might have seemed at the time, because it was somewhere in this pause, in the resting and the recovering, that the next idea began to take its shape. People do not usually make their largest decisions in the middle of the storm. They make them afterward, in the lull, when they can finally lift their heads and look at the whole of what has happened. Spring Valley was that lull, and in it, slowly, the family began to turn a new possibility over in their minds, because this was not really an ending. They were far too young to simply stop, and there was a little girl in front of them whose whole life still lay ahead. Spring Valley was a place to catch their breath, but it was a borrowed breath, taken in a borrowed house, and sooner or later they were going to have to step back out and try, all over again, to make some ground of their own. And here is a thing worth noticing if you're keeping count. This was already the second time this young marriage had been driven back to rest and regroup. The first was after the fever, when a strong man had to learn to live with a cane. This was the second. A whole way of life had failed out from under them, and they had pulled back to gather what strength they had left, which means that whatever they reached for next was not going to be a first, hopeful attempt anymore. It was going to be a second try at being saved. A larger gamble, made by two people who had already lost very nearly everything once, and who knew now, in a way they had not known on their wedding day, exactly how much a person could lose. And it was there, in that Minnesota winter, that word of a warmer country far to the south began, quietly, to reach them. They spent that time in Minnesota gathering themselves back up, and somewhere in it, the idea that would carry them clear across the country took hold. The heart of that idea was Almanzo's body. Anyone near them could see plainly enough that the hard northern cold had done his legs no favours, and it was not a great leap to hope that a warmer, gentler climate might treat him more kindly. That was the centre of it. Not adventure, not restlessness, but something much closer to medicine. The desperate hope that somewhere warmer might help him regain a little of the strength the north had taken. And there was a pull toward one particular warm place, Florida. Family had already gone south. On Laura's side, her cousin Peter had settled down there, and in the wider family, Almanzo's own brother Prairie had gone south as well. So Florida was never just a warm dot on a faraway map to the two of them. It was a place where some of their own people were already living, where there would be kin at the other end of the journey. And when you're weighing whether to gamble everything you have left on a distant country, it makes all the difference in the world whether anyone you know is already there in it. This was the family pull from Florida. Warmth and kin in the same direction, reaching a worn couple all the way up in a Minnesota winter. And think what that second part would have meant to two people who up to now had met most of their troubles largely on their own. The fever, the loss, the fire, the debt, all of it had come down on one small household out on a claim without much of anyone close by to share the weight of it. To go somewhere and have family already there, already settled in, was to go somewhere they might not be entirely alone in whatever came next. It is not hard to see why kin at the far end of a hard road would have counted for a great deal to a couple who had carried so much of their road by themselves. There is a piece of local history kept down in that part of Florida that remembers a party of these settlers coming down by boat, with a detail or two set down in a diary about the trip. That is local colour, and worth taking gently. The surer thing underneath it is simpler. Kin had gone south, and the pull of that warmer country, and of the family already living in it, had reached this struggling young couple. Whatever passed between them when they finally decided, they kept to themselves. What we do know is the decision itself, and the decision was an enormous one. They would let the very last of Dakota go. They would take Rose, and the Cane, and the lost Laura would so rarely speak of, and they would go south. All the way south to Florida, toward a gentler climate they hoped might help him, and toward family who might make a strange country feel, at last, like a place two tired people could stay. And so the question that had been sitting quietly underneath their whole marriage, the question of what was finally going to save this family, got its first real answer. For now, the answer was a warmer climate. For now, the answer was Florida. They believed, with everything left in them, that the warm air down there would help him where the north had not. And they hoped, though this hope was a good deal quieter, that they might at long last belong somewhere, among their own kin, in a softer country. And here is what to hold on to, as they turn their faces south, because it is the truest thing about this whole moment. Everything they were betting on now was hope, and not one bit of it was fact yet. They did not know whether the warm air would help him. They did not know whether Florida would take them in or hold them off. They only believed, the way people believe when they have run out of other things to try. They were right about one of those two hopes, as it would turn out, and wrong about the other. But there was no way on earth to know yet which was which, not standing there in a Minnesota winter, with the whole, hopeful plan still stretched out ahead of them. All they knew was that they were going, and so, in their own time, they turned toward the south, toward the heat, toward the piney woods they had never laid eyes on, carrying with them everything they still had, and everything they had already lost, to find out whether Florida would be the thing that saved them. And that is where the road takes us next. In October of 1891, after the long road south, the little family came out at the far end of it, into the Florida Panhandle. Stop here for a moment, and let the whole world change around you, the way it changed around them. Everything we have walked through so far tonight has been cold. Dakota cold. That hard, killing prairie cold. And then the grey Minnesota winter that came after it. Hold all of that in your mind for one more moment, and then set it gently down, because none of it is here anymore. The country they stepped into did not look like anything the two of them had ever known. Where Dakota was flat and dry and open, all clean, hard sky over open grass, this was very nearly the opposite of every part of that. Tall pines stood close together and never quite fell silent, a low murmur always moving somewhere up in the tops of them. The water here did not race the way northern water raced. It crept, slow and dark, back among the roots of the trees. And in that slow, dark water there were alligators. For two people whose whole idea of land was open prairie under a wide, bright sky, this was a foreign country in every sense that mattered. Think of what the eye had to do down there. On the prairie you could see for miles, see weather coming a full day off, see a wagon on the horizon long before it reached you. Here the trees closed the distance down to almost nothing. The world stopped a few rows of pine away and would not let you look past it. Even the light came in differently, filtered and green and broken, where prairie light had always fallen wide and plain and whole, and the air itself was a different thing in the lungs, warm and wet and heavy, thick in a way prairie air had never once been. This was the Choctawhatchee country, deep in the piney woods, and those first days it must have felt as though they had not merely travelled, but had crossed clear over into some other world entirely. And it was not any one of those things by itself that made it so strange to them. It was all of it at once. The close trees and the slow dark water and the thick wet air and the sky you could no longer see the whole of. A prairie family had a frame for cold and for wind and for distance and for drought. They had no frame at all for this. Nearly everything the senses reported down here reported something unfamiliar, and there is a particular tiredness in that, in landing somewhere where even the air in your lungs is a thing you have to learn. The country was truly that different, and two people cannot step into a world that different and not feel, for a good while, entirely out of place in it. But here is the thing that made all that strangeness worth it, at least at the start. In Dakota, October means the door of winter is already swinging shut, the first hard nights already testing the walls. Here, October was still warm, and a warm October was not just weather on the skin. That warmth was the whole reason they had come at all. It was, in a real sense, the thing itself, the very thing they had travelled all that way to stand inside of. It is worth sitting for a moment with just how opposite the two climates were, because the whole gamble turned on that difference. Up north, cold had become part of the problem. The illness had left his legs damaged, and the northern winters offered him no relief. Drought had ruined the wheat. Down here the air was very nearly the opposite substance, warm and wet and heavy, and instead of a season that shut everything down and locked the doors against it, this was a country where the growing did not simply stop for half the year. For a body already damaged by illness, that reversal was the entire point of the journey. They had not come south for the look of the place. They had come for the plain difference between an air that offered no relief and one that might help. They had heard, up in the cold, that the south would be gentle. They were about to find out that gentle was not quite the whole of the word. The south was many things at once, warm and green and close and strange, a country that pressed in on you where the prairie had always opened out. Whatever they had pictured from the far side of a Minnesota winter, the real place was going to turn out more complicated than the dream of it had ever been. Still, for those first warm days, complicated could wait its turn. The killing cold was behind them. That much was simple, and after the run of years they had just lived through, a warm October all on its own was very nearly a gift. So they had done it. They had made the enormous gamble, and here they stood in the middle of it, in the warm, murmuring woods, a long way from everything they had ever known, waiting to learn whether this was the place that would finally hold them. And it will help to know, walking into it, roughly how long this whole southern chapter lasted, because it was not long at all. Less than a year, about 10 months from that warm October to the summer that came after it. That is a small window for so much to happen inside of, and it is part of what makes this year sit so strangely in the whole of their lives. Everything we're about to walk through, the settling in, the work, the slow easing of his body, the slow closing in around her, and the turning back north again, All of it happened inside a single turn of the seasons. Keep that somewhere in the back of your mind as we go. It went by fast this year, even as it quietly changed the whole direction of their story. So where exactly were they now? We can set them close, even if not to the inch. They had come to the piney woods of Holmes County, in the Florida Panhandle, near a small settlement called Westville. And Holmes County itself in those years was thin, quiet, out-of-the-way country. Not a place many people up north would ever have heard of, and certainly not a place a Dakota family would have carried any picture of before they came to it. This was the Panhandle, the long western arm of Florida, a good ways from the beaches and the bright coast most people picture when they picture that state. It was piney woods and small scattered farms and slow, dark water, and it kept to itself. To come to a place like that, off the wide-open northern prairie, was to arrive somewhere genuinely off the edge of anything they had ever known. That whole stretch of woods was stitched together out of little communities whose names blurred and overlapped into one another, the way names tend to do in thinly settled country. These were not large places with hard edges and clear lines drawn on a map. They were clusters of families scattered through the trees close enough to share a name and a road and a church, and not a great deal more than that. No tidy town square, no straight streets with a sign at the corner telling you which place you had arrived in. Just farms and cabins set here and there among the pines. And if you have ever tried to find the exact spot where someone lived a long time ago in country like that, you will know why we speak of it the careful way and leave the edges soft. There was even a little meeting house out in that country, a Methodist church called Mount Ida standing among those small communities. What matters here, though, is not the exact address on a map we do not have. What matters is who was already waiting for them in those woods, because they had not come to this one far-off patch of pine by closing their eyes and setting a finger on a map. They had come because their own people were here. On Laura's side of the family, her cousin Peter had already come south and settled into this very country, and it was Peter and Peter's people who gave the two of them a reason to aim at this exact stretch of the Florida woods out of the whole warm south they might have chosen instead. It is not hard to imagine what that might have meant at the very start of it. To bring your husband and your small girl this long way, and then to arrive, at the end of all those miles, to a face you already knew. Kin were here. And after the fire and the debt and the small grave they had left behind them in the north, the simple fact of family standing in a strange land was surely no small thing. And yet here is the quiet catch folded up inside it. The thing that is going to matter more and more as this year goes on. The family was here. Yes, Peter was here. But the family was a small handful of familiar faces set down in the middle of a whole country of strangers. Step past the little circle of your own kin, and everyone else in those woods was a southerner, with southern ways and southern speech, a whole manner of living that had grown up out of this hot green land, and had nothing at all to do with the cold, flat prairie the Wilders had come from. So they had landed among their own people, and they had landed among strangers, both at the very same time. And which of those two things would come to weigh the most when the year was finally done, was the whole question this place had quietly set itself to answer for them. And that gap between the handful of familiar faces and the whole strange country pressing in around them is where a great deal of what happened next would live. It is one thing to be far from home if the place you land in slowly becomes a home to you. It is another thing entirely to be far from home in a country that stays foreign no matter how long you stay in it, with only a few of your own people standing between you and all that strangeness. I am running a little ahead of the record in saying so, and I know it. But you can already feel the shape of the trouble beginning to form, out there in those woods, in the plain fact of a northern family set down in the middle of a southern country. For now, though, there was work to be done, and the work turned out to be a whole new education. They had come, in part, to help Peter with his farming, and Peter's farming looked nothing at all like the farming the Wilders knew. Up north, the whole of the plan had been wheat, that one golden crop running clear out to the horizon and back again. You put in wheat, you tended wheat, you prayed over wheat, and in a fair year the wheat paid you. It was a single-minded sort of farming, one crop and one hope. All the eggs in one wide golden basket. Down here, in the warm wet ground, the crops were different, and there were more of them. Corn, cotton, peanuts, tucked down in the sandy soil, sweet potatoes. It was a different language of farming altogether, a different calendar, a different set of things a body had to learn to do with its own two hands. What went in when, what liked the wet and what wanted the dry, how you worked a field of cotton against a field of corn. None of it was the wheat country they had spent their whole lives learning by heart. And notice what that difference actually was, because it matters more than it might seem at first. Up north, everything had ridden on the one crop. Down here, the work was spread across several. Corn and cotton and peanuts and sweet potatoes, each with its own season and its own demands, and not a one of them the single golden field they had staked their Dakota lives on. They did not come south carrying any theory about this, but looking back from where we stand, you can see something in it all the same. This was farming that did not rest on one thing, and a family that had just been ruined by resting everything on one thing was, for a season, living inside the other way of doing it, whether they ever once thought of it in those terms or not, and Almanzo set himself to learning it anyway. That itself tells you something about the man, and about the two of them together. They had not come south to sit in the shade and be sick and wait for a miracle to find them. They had come to work and to mend if they could, and to try, one more time, to build something that might hold. So out into the fields he went, cane and all, to learn a whole new way of drawing a living up out of the ground. And then, slowly, quietly, without anyone mourning you could point to and name, the thing they had travelled all that way hoping for began, in fact, to happen. The warmer weather helped him. The heat that would sit so heavily on the rest of them turned out for Almanzo to do some real and gentle good. His condition improved down there in a way it simply had not been able to in the northern cold. But let me say it carefully, because the care is part of the truth here. No one wrote that he was made new, or that the hard winter had been undone as though it had never happened. What the record gives us is quieter than that, and steadier. The warmth eased some of the difficulty. The move achieved, at the very least, part of the very thing they had crossed all that distance to reach. And think for a moment what even that much would have meant to the two of them. They had gambled everything they had left in the world on a single desperate idea, that a warmer country might give a good man back some of what the North had taken from him. And now, in the warm months of that first Florida stretch, that idea was quietly proving to have some real truth in it. For the first time in a long run of hard years, something in this worn family's life was moving in the right direction rather than the wrong one. So let yourself feel a little hope for them here. It was real hope, and they had paid dearly for the chance at it, and it deserves to be felt before the rest of the year does what it is going to do. What they got was help, and not healing. His condition improved, but part was no small thing to this particular family. Part was a great deal more than the cold had ever once given back. After the run of years they had lived through, a real and partial mending, honestly come by, was worth more than most whole things are worth to people who have never had to do without. Because while that good was reaching Almanzo, something very different was settling over Laura, and it ran in nearly the opposite direction. The same country that seemed to be doing her husband some good was, at the very same slow pace, closing itself against her. He was folding into the place, into the work, into the warm, long days. She was becoming more and more with each passing week the one thing down there she could not help but be: a stranger, an outsider, a northern woman set down in the deep southern woods, among people whose whole way of being in the world was not her way, and was not going to become her way. And here is the remarkable thing, the thing that lets us say this with real confidence rather than mere guesswork. Laura told us so herself. Years and years afterward, when she came to write a short account of her own life, she reached back into this very stretch of it and set her finger squarely on this exact feeling. She wrote that down there, in those Florida woods, a Yankee woman was more of a curiosity than any of them. Sit with that one line for a moment, because it is carrying a great deal of quiet weight. She's speaking of the alligators. She's speaking of the strange slow water and the murmuring pines and everything about that country that a northerner would find wild and foreign and worth stopping to look at twice. And she's telling us that she, Laura, a plain farm wife off the northern prairie, was stranger to those woods than any of it. That the greatest curiosity in the whole strange landscape was not the wildlife at all. It was herself. There is a particular kind of loneliness folded up inside that one chosen word, and here I am reading closely into it. A curiosity is not quite the same thing as a person disliked. Nothing in the record tells us that anyone was unkind to her. It seems to be something quieter than unkindness, and in its own way harder to carry. A curiosity is a thing looked at. The one who is different in the room, whose speech falls a little strangely on the local ear, whose ways are a little off, whose very presence makes people glance and then glance again. And a person can bear that for a little while. A person can be the interesting newcomer for a single season and hold it lightly enough. But to be the curiosity week after week, with no end to it anywhere in sight and no way to ever quite stop being the strange one, that is a weight of a different order altogether. It does not bruise. It simply, slowly, quietly wears a person thin. That, at least, is how it reads to me. Hold the two of them side by side, and you can feel how hard it must have been. Her husband was quietly getting the thing he came for. She was getting, week by week, the settled sense that she did not belong there and could not learn how to belong. The same woods, the same warm months, working two opposite kinds of change on two people who loved each other and had come all that long way together for the very same reasons, and it is worth remembering exactly what we are standing on. One phrase, in her own hand, set down long after the fact. She named herself the curiosity of that country, more of one than the alligators in the slow water. That is the piece that is truly hers. The loneliness all around it is mine, read into that one word. She did not leave us the scenes, she left us the word. But it is a heavy word for a person to reach for, sitting down years later to sum up a whole year of a life, and I think we are right to let it carry as much as it does. There is one small story that has come down to us out of those Florida woods, and it puts a picture to all of this better than any amount of explaining ever could. I want to be careful and honest about where it comes from, though, before I hand it over to you. It was not written down at the time. It is a family story, the kind that gets told across a kitchen table and handed down the generations. This particular one was remembered many decades later, long after everyone in it was gone, by one of the relatives on the Florida side of the family, and only then set into words at all. So take it for exactly what it is. Not a photograph of a certain afternoon, but a memory of how the family, looking back across all those years, remembered Laura in that place. And here is the picture they kept. The family was out planting corn, out under that high, hard Florida sun, the sun these southern folk had grown up beneath and simply learned to live under. And Laura, so the story goes, came out to help with the planting, holding up over herself a big black umbrella to keep that fierce sun off her. But a person cannot easily plant corn with one hand while holding an umbrella aloft with the other, and she could not manage to do both at the same time. And as the story's remembered, Cousin Peter, at last in plain exasperation, told her to go on back to the house. There is a gentle comedy in that picture, and I think we are allowed to smile at it, so long as we're smiling with her and not at her. A woman trying to plant a whole field with an umbrella in one hand, holding off an entire hot green world, one small black umbrella at a time, a world she had never once asked to be dropped into the middle of. There is something a little funny in that, and something a little sad in it, and honestly the two of them turn out to be the same thing, which is very often the way with the truest small stories. Because that umbrella was never really about the sun, or it was about the sun, and it was about a great deal more than the sun besides. It was her whole situation, pressed down into one plain object you could hold in your hand. She was a northern woman, made by a northern place, trying to live and work beneath a southern sky she could not quite step out under and simply belong to. That is how one branch of the family remembered her all those long years later, the one under the umbrella. So here, in the very middle of it, is the strange, quiet, almost unbearable heart of the whole thing. It helped. That is the part so many quick tellings rush straight past, and it is the part that matters most of all. The warm climate did some real good for the very thing they had crossed all that distance hoping to mend. Almanzo's condition improved down there. By the one plain measure that had sent them south in the first place, the move achieved part of what they had hoped it would. It did not undo the winter. The cane did not go into the fire, and the damage was not wiped clean away. What the warmth did was gentler than that, and in its own way the more remarkable for being so plain. His body did better in the heat than it had ever been able to do in the cold, and measured against the one thing the whole gamble had been built to do, that means it worked, at least in part. It is not a small thing to say. They had bet everything they had left on a single desperate idea, that warmth might help a man the cold had harmed. And the warmth did help. The idea, it turned out, had truth in it after all. This was supposed to be the ending. Do you feel that? This was the happy ending they had crawled toward through the fire and through the debt and past the small, unnamed grave. A family carries a hurting man into the warm south, and the warm south does him some real and gentle good. That was the story they had set out to live. That was the story that should have closed the book right here, with the family finally getting some part of the one thing they had suffered so much and travelled so far to reach. And that is exactly why this year is so quietly, strangely sad. Because they did get part of it. The one clear aim of the whole enormous gamble was, at least in part, achieved out there in the piney woods in less than a single year. And it was not going to be enough. Not nearly enough. It was not going to be the thing that let them stay. That is the turn this whole story rests on, and it is a gentler and a truer turn than any invented one could ever be. Not a cure that failed, a move that did some real good and still, somehow, left the family unable to remain and live on it. Because a body helped is one thing, and a life a person can actually bear to live is another thing entirely. And out in those warm woods the Wilders were running straight into the hard gap between the two, the gap between a man doing better and a family being able to call a place home. So let's follow that gap now, honestly, and see how the difficulty came to outweigh the real good the warmth was doing him. Start with the plainest, most documented part of it, the part no one has to guess at. Laura did not like the climate. That heavy, wet, unending Florida heat, the kind that never quite breaks, that sits on a person day and night straight through the long southern summer. She simply could not take to it. And she did not take to the ways of the people around her either, the customs of that backwoods country, the whole texture of daily life in it. That much is written down plainly enough. She did not like the humid climate, and she did not care for the local customs. Those are the documented facts, and they are facts enough to stand on. Beneath the documented facts, though, there was something heavier. From Laura's side of the ledger, this place was never going to become home. Her own chosen word tells you as much. She was the curiosity, set a little apart from the life going on around her, and no amount of warm weather was ever going to close that particular distance. And there may have been one more weight she carried into those woods, a weight the warm air could do nothing at all for. She'd come south not long after losing a child. It is difficult not to wonder whether an older grief like that, carried quietly, might have made an unfamiliar and lonely place harder still to bear. We only know that she had it, and that she carried it, as she carried it everywhere she ever went, in silence. Those who have spent their lives studying this stretch of Laura's life reach for strong words about it. One historical account describes her time in that place as isolating, and in its words, as ultimately threatening. I want to be careful with that word. No specific incident of harm survives, no scene of menace that anyone ever wrote down. What survives is that considered sense, handed down by people who studied her closely, of a place that had grown lonely and hard for her over those months. Beyond the word itself, the record does not tell us more. So look at what this warm country had made of the two of them, side by side. Her husband doing better, easing into the place, receiving the very thing they came for. And his wife, more the outsider with every warm week, worn thinner, carrying a private grief in a country full of strangers. The same woods, the same warmth, working two opposite changes on two people who loved each other. And that was the hard arithmetic sitting there in front of them now. Staying meant the good the warmth was doing him would go on. And staying also meant that whatever the place was doing to Laura would go on right alongside it. Day after warm day, with no end anyone could see. And here is the shape of it I keep turning over. The very same place was doing two opposite things at once, and doing them to two people who had come there together, for each other, out of the very same trouble. To him it was medicine, of a partial and a real kind. To her it was a slow closing in. We cannot say that the two of them sat down and weighed the one against the other. What we can say is that the good and the harm were both real, and both quietly growing, in the same warm woods, at the same time. And a family cannot go on forever with the two of them pulling that hard in opposite directions. Something, in the end, has to give. And in the end, they turned around. It was August of 1892. Less than a year in the Piney woods, only about 10 months in all, from October of 1891 until that August. And then the little family, Laura and Almanzo and Rose, pointed themselves back toward De Smet, back toward the northern country they had left behind and set out for home. Here is what I need you to hold clearly as they go, because it is the whole strange point of this year, and it is so terribly easy to get it backward. They did not leave because Florida had done nothing for them. It had. The warmth had done real good for Almanzo, some genuine part of the very thing they'd gone all that way south to find. By the one plain measure that had carried them there, the move had not been a failure at all. And they left anyway. It is a quietly remarkable thing to do, to go all that way chasing after one single hope, to find that the hope had real truth in it, to feel it doing some genuine good in your own small family, and then to gather yourselves up and carry that helped along man back toward the very cold that had harmed him in the first place. They were turning their backs on the place that had done him good. We do not have the conversation the two of them had about it. What we do have is the shape of the thing. They left, and the record ties that leaving not to any failure of Almanzo's recovery but to Laura, to the heat she could not abide, to the local ways she could not take to her own documented sense of being a curiosity in a place that was never going to become home. The body had done better, the belonging had not come, and a family in the end cannot go on living for very long on only the one of those without the other. It was surely never so clean or so plainly spoken as a sitting down to weigh his health against her happiness. But you can feel, I think, that a decision like this one must have carried a real cost and carried it in more than a single direction. Whatever it meant to Laura to be given back the north, it must have meant something too, and something hard, for Almanzo to leave behind the country that had done his body such quiet good. That much, at least, seems fair to say. So think about what they were carrying back up the road with them, out of those warm woods. A man whose condition had improved, with the cane still there at his side, the same plain wooden cane that had come south with them and was now turning north again. A loss Laura would rarely speak of later had come south, and was now coming north again, and a hard new piece of knowledge that must have sat very strangely on them both. That they had found some real part of their miracle at last, and that even the real part of it had not been enough to let them stay. Which left the oldest question of all still open, the one that had been trailing this family ever since the fever first walked in through their door. What was actually going to save them? Not the wheat. They had learned that one hard out on the Dakota Prairie. And not the warm air either. They were learning that now, on the long road back out of Florida. Twice now they had staked everything they had on a single answer, and twice the single answer had turned out to be not the whole of it after all. So they went north, up out of the piney woods, away from the warm, murmuring country that had done them some real good and still could not manage to hold them. Back toward despair, and toward a future whose shape they could not yet begin to make out. And the real answer, the thing that would one day actually save this worn and stubborn little family, was still somewhere out ahead of them. Not in a crop, not in a climate. Somewhere, and as something, they had not yet even thought to look. And the road, as it turned out, still had a good long way left to run, and a good deal more still to ask of them, before it ever brought them to it. They came back to De Smet in August of 1892, back to the same small railroad town on the northern prairie they had first set out from, back under the same wide, hard sky, and back into the very country whose winters had done Almanzo's legs such harm in the first place. But they did not come back the way they had gone out. Let the tired part of you settle here for a little while, because the road has been a long one tonight, and we are turning now toward the last of it. When the two of them had first set out to make a life, they had gone out onto a homestead, onto ground that was meant in time to become their very own. Now they came back into town and did about the humblest thing a farming family can do in a farming country. They rented a small house in town that belonged to somebody else. There is a quiet weight in that, and we do not need to invent a single thing to feel it. They had gone out with a farm and a plan, and every hope two young people could carry between them, and they came back with neither the farm nor the plan, to a rented house in town to begin again from very nearly the beginning. There is only the fact of it, and the fact of it is heavy enough on its own, to have gone out so full of plans, and to come home with the plans all spent, and to take a rented room, and to begin once more at the very bottom of a hill you thought you had already climbed. It is hard not to feel the humility that must have been folded into that, whatever face the two of them chose to wear out in the daylight. And there is a thing worth saying about this particular kind of hard, because it is a different kind than any we have met so far tonight. It is not the sharp hard of a fire or of a fever or of a small grave in the summer ground. It is the slow, quiet, grinding hard of starting over, of setting your hand to the exact same beginning a second time, when you already know, right down in your bones, precisely how much a beginning can cost you. That takes a kind of courage that never once looks like courage from the outside. From the outside it only ever looks like a tired family, carrying on. And there is one more thing in it worth naming. Twice now they had staked everything on a single large answer, and neither answer had turned out to be a complete one. The wheat, and then the warm south. The one had failed outright. The other had genuinely helped Almanzo, but it had not become a home the family could keep. And here they were, back very nearly where they had started, renting with a child to raise and a long road still ahead of them. A person could be forgiven, at a point like that, for deciding the world simply meant to keep them down, and for lying down under the weight of it. That they did not, that two people this worn found it in themselves to get up and begin again, is the part of them I find I admire most in the whole of this story. But here is where the whole shape of this long story quietly begins to turn. And it turns so gently that a person could very nearly miss the moment it happens. Because this time, worn down and back at the very bottom, They did not go looking for a miracle. They had tried the miracle already, twice, if you count it honestly. The wheat had been the first of them, that one golden crop out on the Dakota prairie that was going to pay for the whole of their lives all at once. And the warm south had been the second, that great gamble that a gentler climate might be the answer to a body a hard winter had harmed. Both of those had been enormous bets, laid down on a single answer, and neither of them in the end had turned out to be the thing that saved this family. So this time, back in De Smet, they did something altogether different, and altogether smaller, and in the end far stronger than either of the grand gambles had ever been. They simply went to work. Not on one great plan that would rescue the whole family in a single season, just on the plain daily labour that was actually there in front of them to be done. And think for a moment about how completely that reversed the shape of their working lives. Farming, the way they had done it, was a gamble by its very nature. You put everything in at the start and then you waited on the weather and the market to decide months later whether you had won or lost. Wage work was the opposite of that. You did the work, and the work brought in a wage that did not rise and fall with the weather or the harvest. No sky to pray to, no single crop to hold your breath over, just labour, and the steady income it brought, set aside a little at a time. It is a smaller way to live, no question. It is also a far steadier one. And steadiness, after the years these two had just come through, may well have been the most valuable thing in the whole world to them. Laura took up work as a seamstress, sewing in a dressmaker's shop in the town. Set it beside the picture we began this whole story with, that field of wheat running clear out to the horizon. This was the opposite of that in nearly every way there is. Indoors and not out under the open sky. Close, careful work done with the hands and the eyes, a needle drawn through cloth again and again, stitching garments for other people, for the steady and modest wage that such work brought in. There was nothing bold in it at all, and nothing that would ever make a story on its own. And it was honest, and it was steady, and it put money on the table that a failed crop never once had. And there is a real dignity in that work of hers, and I do not want it to slip past unnoticed just because it is quiet. Sewing for a dressmaker was skilled work. It asked a good eye and a steady hand and no small amount of patience, the ability to make a thing well enough that strangers would pay good money for it. Laura had grown up doing hard prairie labour of every kind, and here she was turning her hands to a wholly different discipline and doing it well enough to help hold her family up through a lean stretch. There is nothing small about a person who can do that, whatever the world may think of the size of the wage. It is one of the plain ways a strong person keeps standing after the grand plans have all fallen down. And Almanzo, the man with the cane, went to work as well, in the ways that his body would still allow him. He took work as a carpenter, and he hired himself out as a day labourer, taking on whatever jobs there were to be had around the town. Think of what that must have meant for him, and I will let you feel it rather than spell out all of it. A man who had once meant to be his own master, out on his own broad acres, answering to no one but the weather, and now, here he was, hiring himself out by the day, building and mending and labouring for other men and for other men's wages. And he did it. Cane and all, whatever the fever had left him with, he got himself up and he did it. Here is the picture I would ask you to hold on to, because it is the true and quiet heart of everything that turns from here. A woman at a needle in a dressmaker's shop. A man with a hammer hiring out by the day. No single grand answer anywhere in the whole of it. Just the two of them, patiently, unremarkably, doing the ordinary work that was honestly theirs to do, and then doing the very hardest thing of all with whatever that work brought home. They saved it. That is the part that matters most in all of this, and it is the part a person is most tempted to say too quickly, so let us not go hurrying past it. They saved their money, carefully and on purpose, and over a long stretch of time. Not out of some sudden windfall, because there was none. Not out of a lucky strike or a fortune fallen from the sky, because nothing at all like that ever came to the two of them. Only out of a seamstress's pay and a labourer's pay, which is to say out of two of the most ordinary livings a person could earn, set aside a little at a time, and then a little more, for far longer than would ever be comfortable. And here, quietly, and with no drama in it whatever, is the true turn of the entire story. After the fever, after the losses of that one terrible summer, the fire and the failed crop and the small grave, after the crushing weight of the debt, after the whole long warm gamble to the south, which had done Almanzo's body some genuine good, and still could never become a home. After all of it, all those enormous blows and all those enormous hopes, the thing that finally began to lift this family back up off the ground was not enormous at all. It was a needle. It was a hammer. It was two tired people going out to work in the morning and keeping what they earned. The Prairie had spent years teaching them, in about the hardest school there is, that a grand gamble can ruin you. And now, in a rented house in De Smet, they were learning the quieter lesson on the far side of that, the one nobody ever thinks to print on a brochure. That patience can save you where boldness could not. That plain work, done faithfully and saved carefully, can do the very thing that no single roll of the dice had ever once managed to do for them. They stayed at it for a good long while, too. This was no quick season of saving before the next adventure came calling. This was the slow, unglamorous rebuilding of a family that had learned, about as hard as a family can ever learn it, exactly how much there was in this world to lose. And little by little, out of the needle and the hammer, something began to grow again that they had not had in years, not land yet, but the beginnings of the means to reach for land, the small solid ground a person only ever comes by through doing the right small thing over and over, long past the point where it stops feeling like any kind of progress at all. And it was out of that patience, and not out of any fresh burst of desperation, that the next hope finally found them. And it was a different sort of hope than any that had come before it, and that difference is the whole of the point. Word began to reach them, in those rebuilding years, of a place down south in Missouri, down in the hill country, in the Ozarks. And it came dressed up in a phrase that some man in the business of selling land had plainly thought about very hard indeed. They called that country the land of the big red apple. You can hear the salesmanship in it, can't you? The land of the big red apple. It is a promotional phrase, a bright and a hopeful bit of language of exactly the kind that men who are selling a place always seem to come up with. And you might well think that a family already burned twice over by bright and hopeful language would have every reason under the sun to turn away from one more shining promise. They had chased the golden wheat once, and they had chased the healing warmth once, and both of those promises had glittered, and both of them had come up short. But watch how differently these two came at this one, because the difference is very nearly everything. They did not simply catch sight of a shining phrase and go running off south after it the way two desperate young people once had. This time there was more underneath it than a slogan. A local man who had actually gone down to that Missouri country and looked at it for himself had brought back word of the place. And this time there was money already set aside, saved slowly and on purpose, held in reserve against just such a chance as this. They were not leaping blind into the dark anymore. They were stepping carefully towards something they had troubled to look at first. And there was one more difference, quieter than the others, and larger than all of them put together, because this new country was not wheat. Hold that up against the very place we began this whole story, all those years and all those miles ago. When Laura and Almanzo first married out on the Dakota Prairie, the whole of the plan had been wheat. One crop, one golden answer. Everything they had staked on that single field doing well under that single sky. And we watched, across all these hard years, what happens when the one answer fails. When the one crop dies, everything dies right along with it, because there is nothing else planted underneath to catch you when you fall. The Missouri country was a different kind of dream altogether, apples, fruit, a place, and a way of farming that leaned toward many things at once, rather than betting the whole of the future on a single one of them. It was, in its very shape, the exact hard lesson the Prairie had spent so many ruinous years pressing down into them. Do not lay everything you have on one crop, one hope, one turn of the weather. Spread it wider than that. Give yourself more than the one way to come through. They had learned that lesson in about the cruelest classroom there is, and now, in the shape of this new Missouri hope, you can see that the lesson had truly taken hold in them. This was not the reckless swing of young people who believed grit alone would be enough to carry them. This was the careful, chastened reach of two people who had already lost very nearly everything once, and who had finally and painfully worked out a wiser way to hope. So the decision to go was not made the way the old decisions had been made. There was no such conversation left to us. But you can feel the difference in the whole manner of it. There was money set by, this time. There was a first-hand account of the place, and underneath the hope there was a plan that had learned something real from every single failure that came before it. This was hope with its eyes open at last, and that, as it would turn out, made all the difference in the world. So set the two southern journeys side by side for a moment, the one they had already made and the one they were about to make. The first, down to Florida, had been a leap taken in desperation, on almost nothing, because they had simply run out of other ideas. This one was different in very nearly every way that counts. There was money behind it this time, saved on purpose against exactly such a chance as this. There was a first-hand look at the country, brought back by a man who had gone and seen it with his own eyes, and there was a plan underneath the whole thing that had learned, the hard way, not to stake everything on a single throw. It was the same family, reaching for the same old hope of a better country. But they were reaching for it now with their eyes open and with something held in reserve, and that difference is a great deal of why this story ends the way it finally does. And so, one more time, this family loaded up a wagon and turned its face toward a far horizon. It was the 17th of July, in the year 1894. On that day, the Wilders left De Smet behind them, this time for good and for all, and set out for the Ozarks of Missouri in a covered wagon. Laura carried a small diary along on that journey, and set her notes down in it as they went, day by day along the road. And so we know something of the shape of that trip from her own hand, though I will let her own words rest quietly where she left them, and only walk the road she recorded, and no further than that. The 17th of July, 1894. It is worth marking a date like that one, because there are not many of them in this story, and this one is a real hinge. That was the day they turned their backs on the northern prairie for good. Not for a season, not to rest and regroup and come back to it, but for good and for all. Whatever De Smet had been to them, and it had been a very great deal, the making of their young hopes and then the breaking of them, they were finished with it now. They loaded the wagon and they pointed it south, and this time they did not look to be coming back. There is something worth pausing on in that picture, one more wagon on one more long road. Think of how much moving this one small family had already done. Out to the homestead, in the very beginning. Back to Spring Valley, when the homestead had failed them. All the long way south to the Florida piney woods, and all the long way north again, when Florida could not hold them. And now here they were once more, a covered wagon pointed at yet another far horizon, hoping one more time that the place waiting at the end of the road might finally be the one that held. And notice, if you would, the small, quiet fact of that diary. This family had made hard journeys before, and we have no such day-by-day record of those. But this time, Laura chose to keep one. There is something in the simple keeping of a record that feels to me of a piece with everything else about this move. A thing looked at, a thing paid attention to, a journey undertaken with the eyes open. But this wagon was different from the ones that had gone before it, and not because the road ahead of it was any gentler. It was different because of who was riding in it. This was not a young couple chasing after a dream on nothing but their own nerve. This was a seasoned and a scarred and a patient family, carrying with them the savings they had earned so slowly, heading toward a plan that had actually been to school on its own failures. And going along with them, the way it had gone along on every road this family had ever travelled, was the cane. The same plain cane that had come into their lives on a killing winter, still a part of Almanzo, going south now toward Missouri the way it had gone everywhere else. Whatever the warm south had done for him, or had not, the cane was still there beside him. By now it was simply a part of the man, and a part of every journey the family made. They travelled the long miles of it right through the heart of that summer, and at the end of the road, in the last days of August, in that year of 1894, they came down into the hill country of southern Missouri, near a town called Mansfield. And there, at long last, they did the thing this whole long story had been reaching toward from its very first mile. They bought a piece of ground of their own, not a great deal of it, 40 acres, and they did not buy it outright, with money to spare, because that was never the kind of family they were, and never had been. They put $100 down on it. $100 saved a little at a time out of a seamstress's needle and a day labourer's hammer, lay down at last on 40 acres of Missouri hillside. And with that land there came something that points straight at the whole new shape of their hope. The sale included about 400 young apple seedlings, 400 small trees, and a family that had finally learned not to put all of itself into only one thing. Think for a moment about the distance in that, after everything we have walked through together tonight. They had left Dakota with a dead wheat crop and a mountain of debt behind them, and here they came into Missouri with 40 acres and 400 young apple trees and a plan that at last spread itself across many things rather than staking it all on the one. The wheat had been a single, desperate answer. These 400 little seedlings were the beginning of a wiser one. Laura gave the place a name. She called it Rocky Ridge. And noticed that it was Laura who gave the place its name. The very same Laura who, down in the Florida woods, had been the outsider, the curiosity, the one who could not seem to find her place among the people there. Here, on this hard hillside, a long way north of all that, she was the one who named the ground. There is something quietly important in that. A person does not usually name a place they mean to leave. They name a place they mean to keep. And I want to be careful and honest with you right here, because this close to the end it would be the easiest thing in all the world to make it sound as though they had finally reached some promised land and could sit themselves down and rest. They had not, and it would not be true to tell it that way. Rocky Ridge was exactly the thing its name says that it was. Rocky, hard and hilly, difficult ground, unproven and unimproved, a very long way off from the settled and productive farm it would only slowly, over many years of hard labour, become. What they came to in the late summer of 1894 was not a reward for all that they had suffered. It was a beginning. 40 rocky acres, $100 down, 400 young apple seedlings, and the whole of the work still standing ahead of them. Think about what those plain numbers actually meant, standing there on that hillside in the late summer of 1894. 40 acres is not a grand estate. $100 down is not a fortune laid out on a table. It is a foothold, the down payment of a family that had been saving patiently for years. And 400 young apple seedlings are not an orchard. They are the promise of one, years off still if the trees took and the family lasted, and that stony soil agreed to cooperate, not one of which was certain on the day they arrived. This was not the end of the struggle. It was the right to begin a different one, on ground they had begun purchasing for themselves, and after everywhere they had been, the plain right to begin, on their own ground, was very nearly everything, but it was theirs, after all of it. After the wheat, and the fever, and the small grave, and the fire, and the debt, and the long warm gamble to the south, they were, at last, standing on ground that belonged to them. And this time they had not come to it by luck, and not by one wild throw of the dice, but by patience, and by ordinary work, and by finally learning how to hope in a wiser way. That, in the end, was what made this ground different from every piece of ground that had come before it. So let me draw it all together now, gently, and say why this farm held when the wheat farm had not. Because the difference between those two is very nearly the whole meaning of everything we have walked through tonight, and this family paid for that difference in years of their lives. Out in Dakota, they had done the thing that so many hopeful young farmers did in that country. They had bet the whole of their future on wheat, on the one crop, and when that one crop failed them, as we watched it fail season after ruinous season, there had been nothing else standing underneath it to break the fall. One answer, and when the one answer went wrong, everything they owned went wrong right along with it. At Rocky Ridge they set out to do the very opposite, and they did it on purpose, and with their eyes open. Having learned their hard lesson out there on the wheat, they built this farm to lean on many things instead of one. A diversified farm worked across different crops and different kinds of labour, suited to the hills and the climate they had actually come to rather than one desperate wager laid against the sky. It would not all rise together any more, and it would not all fall together either. If the one thing failed, some other thing might still carry them through it. And that is the whole difference between the farm that had ruined them and the farm that would finally hold, and hold it did. Not overnight, though, and not without years more of hard and patient labour. The struggle did not simply end on the day they arrived. Nothing about that rocky ground was easy, and nothing about it came quickly. But this land, worked in this new and wiser way, slowly became the thing that no other ground had ever once managed to be for them. It became permanent. A place they did not have to flee, a place that did not burn them out, or freeze them out, or quietly drive them off it. Rocky Ridge became their home, and it stayed their home for the rest of their long lives. That old pattern of staking everything and losing everything and loading up the wagon one more time, that long and grinding pattern was, at last, broken here. On 40 rocky acres in the Missouri hills, worked with patience by two people who had finally learned how to work them. And I want to be honest about what that diversified way of farming did and did not promise them, because it would be easy to make it sound like a magic key, and it was nothing of the kind. Spreading their work across many things did not guarantee that they would prosper. Plenty of hard years still lay ahead of them on that rocky ground, and plenty of ordinary grinding struggle. What it did was change the odds. It meant that a bad season for one crop was no longer a death sentence for the whole farm, the way a failed wheat crop had been up north. It gave them more than one thread to hold on to, and a family with more than one thread in its hands can survive the snapping of any single one of them. That, and not any sudden stroke of good fortune, is the quiet difference that finally let this ground hold where no ground before it ever had. Now let me turn us back, just once, and just for a little while, before we let all of this rest, back to that strange warm year down south. Because I have been carrying a question the whole long way tonight, and it is time now, gently, to look at what Florida really was, in the end. It would be easy enough to call that Florida year a simple failure and have done with it. Less than a year they lasted there, and then they turned north again, and it never did become their home. By the plainest sort of measure, it did not work. But that is not quite the truest way to see it, I think. They never set out a tidy moral of their Florida year, and I will not press one into their mouths that they did not speak themselves. But look at what that year actually did, when you set it in its proper place in the whole long line of their lives. The climate down there had done Almanzo some genuine good. It had helped his body in a way that the northern cold never once had, and that much is real, and it mattered, and it was no small part of why they had gone. And the very same year taught them something else besides, in about the hardest and the loneliest way there is, that a place which helps a body is not the same thing as a place a family can actually live in. Looking at the shape of their lives afterward, it is difficult not to read it that way. Belonging, it turns out, is its own kind of need, as real in its way as any easing in a man's legs, and no amount of warm weather can supply that need if it is simply not there to be had. And it is difficult, looking back across the whole of it, not to see how that hard and lonely year fed the wiser rebuilding that came after it. They had gone south chasing the one grand answer, and they had found that even when the grand answer partly worked, even then it was not enough to hold them. And then they had come home and done the patient, ordinary, unglamorous thing instead, and that was the thing that finally held. The shape of their lives after it moved in that direction. The family that reached for a single miracle in 1891 had become, by 1894, a family that built something broad and patient and lasting instead. It is difficult, at the very least, not to wonder whether that hard, warm year was a part of what taught them the difference. And there is one more small irony folded into it, and I will hand it to you as gently as I can, because it is the sort of thing that is almost too neat to be true, and yet it is true all the same. That very corner of the Florida piney woods, the place that Laura found so hard, the place that never did become a home to her, the place she left behind her after less than a year there, remembers her now. Of all the countless people who ever passed through those woods, the one that country holds on to, the one who became its quiet and its abiding claim to fame, is the very northern woman who had found it so hard to live there at all. She never sought that, and I cannot imagine she would ever once have guessed it. And there is something in that turn of things that I find myself. I cannot quite stop turning over. So let us come all the way back now to the small things we started with, and let each of them rest. Remember the cane. That plain wooden cane came into this story on a killing Dakota winter, when a fever reached down into a strong young man's legs and left him leaning on it for the rest of his days. It went south to Florida, and north again, and on to Missouri. And it came, at the very last, to Rocky Ridge, and it stayed there, at the side of a man who had finally found a piece of ground that he could keep. The cane never did leave him. But in the end, it never stopped him either. He carried it all the way to a home that held, and remember the small grave, back north, the one with no name upon it, only a few plain words cut into a little stone. That loss came along with them too, quietly, over every mile of every road, the way such losses always do. Laura almost never spoke of it, and carried it in her own silence to the very end of her long life. Reaching Rocky Ridge did not heal it, because some things are never healed, only carried. But the family that carried it did, at last, find a place to set the rest of their burdens down. They found somewhere they could stay, and for a family that had lost as much as this one had, that was no small grace. And remember the wheat, that one golden crop, that whole single-minded plan they had married their young lives to, out on the open prairie all those years ago. Remember how they staked everything they had upon it, and how it failed them, and how the failing of that one answer very nearly took all they had along with it. And then set beside it those 400 small apple trees, and the diversified farm in the Missouri hills, and the family that had finally learned not to lay it all on a single field beneath a single sky. The whole long journey in its way runs right between those two pictures, from the one crop that ruined them to the many things that finally held them up. And so, at the very last, we come back around to the question that has walked beside us the whole way tonight. What was finally going to save this family? We watched them ask it across all these long years and answer it wrong twice over. It was not the wheat, and it was not the warm southern air either, for all the genuine good it did his body. Those were the miracles they reached for, and neither miracle was the thing. What saved them, as I read it, was something quieter than any miracle, and harder and truer. It was the two of them, holding on to each other through loss after loss that might have pulled two lesser people clean apart. It was humility, the hard-won willingness to stop chasing after one grand answer and simply go to work with a needle and a hammer. And it was the right ground at the last, worked in a wiser way, a patient and a many-sided home instead of one desperate bet. Not a warmer climate, not a lucky crop, only those three plain things carried and earned across more than 10 long years of trying. Laura once said that down in those Florida woods, a Yankee woman was a greater curiosity than the alligators. She was speaking of herself. She had not been able to belong there, and she knew it. But she found her belonging in the end. Not in the warm South that never quite took to her, but on a rocky Missouri farm that she named with her own hands, and worked with her own hands, and stayed on until she was old. The woman who could not make a home in Florida made one in the hills, and it held her, and it holds her memory still. Rest now. The long road is walked. The family is home. Good night.